Maybe it's time for some fresh thinking around here, old timer. That's what Tyler Hoffman said to me while I was debugging the security protocols that kept his father's company from getting hacked into oblivion. The kid was 25, fresh out of business school, and had the nerve to call me old timer. My name is Andrew Sullivan. I'm 49 years old, and I've been keeping CyberGuard Industries' cybersecurity systems running for 22 years. I hold 4 patents for the industrial security frameworks that protect half the manufacturing plants on the West Coast. Specifically, the authentication protocols that prevent unauthorized access to factory control systems, and the encryption algorithms that secure data transfers between manufacturing equipment and central monitoring stations. The kid telling me about fresh thinking couldn't secure a lemonade stand. I was working late on a Tuesday night, same as I'd done for over 2 decades. The office was empty except for security and me. I preferred it that way. No meetings about synergy, no presentations about digital transformation, just code and coffee. Tyler walked by in his expensive suit, carrying a tablet like it was the holy grail of business innovation. "Still grinding away, Andrew," he said, stopping at my workstation. "Don't you have a family to get home to?" I looked up from my screen where I was patching a vulnerability in our manufacturing client authentication system, just making sure Boeing's factory controls don't get compromised by script kiddies. He glanced at my monitor like he was trying to read Sanskrit. "Right? Well, maybe you should delegate more. Leave the heavy lifting to people who understand modern workflows." I didn't respond. Tyler had been at the company for 3 months and thought he understood cybersecurity because he'd taken a course on digital leadership. But explaining network security to someone whose biggest technical achievement was a PowerPoint presentation seemed pointless. After he walked away, I sat there thinking about how much had changed since his father Gerald became our new CTO 6 months ago. Gerald Hoffman, 47 years old, came from McKinsey, brought in by the board to modernize our operations and prepare for scale. His resume looked impressive: 15 years managing large teams, MBA from Northwestern, experience with digital transformation initiatives. What he didn't have was any understanding of how cybersecurity actually worked. I'd been at CyberGuard since it was a 30-person startup, working out of a converted warehouse in Georgetown. Back then, our founder Tom Bradley would sit with us during all-nighters, ordering Chinese food and working through complex security architectures. Tom understood the technology because he'd built the first systems himself. He stepped down as CEO 8 months ago after his second heart attack, and the board decided we needed professional management. My patents covered the core authentication systems that verify legitimate users before granting access to, industrial control networks, the encryption protocols that scramble sensitive manufacturing data during transmission, and the real-time threat detection algorithms that identify suspicious activity in factory automation systems. Without those components, CyberGuard was just another security company with fancy marketing. I'd developed them on my own time, using my personal equipment, because I wanted to solve problems that the industry hadn't even recognized yet. The patents were filed under my name because I'd paid for the legal work myself, and the transfer paperwork to the company was still in progress. My lawyer had advised me to wait until after my next performance review to ensure proper compensation for the intellectual property. Standard practice in our industry, but it meant the patents were still technically mine for another 2 months. Tyler had joined as strategic operations manager, reporting directly to his father. He had no official technical role, but he'd been sitting in on engineering meetings and offering suggestions about resource optimization and agile methodologies. Last week, he'd suggested that our development team was overstaffed and we could deliver better results with fewer senior-level positions. I'd been watching the dynamic between father and son carefully. Gerald would ask Tyler's opinion on technical decisions that should have involved the engineering leads. Tyler would nod thoughtfully and offer consultant speak about efficiency and modernization. Neither of them ever asked me about the technical feasibility of their ideas, despite the fact that I'd designed most of the systems they were discussing. The warning signs had been building for weeks. My name disappeared from technical documentation without explanation. Meeting invites that used to include me automatically were now going to core strategic team only. When I asked about it, Gerald's assistant told me it was just organizational streamlining. 2 days ago, I overheard a conversation between Gerald and our head of HR about restructuring the technical team to align with industry best practices. They were in the conference room with the door cracked open, and they hadn't noticed me getting coffee. Gerald was talking about transitioning senior engineers into advisory roles to make room for younger talent with fresh perspectives. Now, after Tyler's comment about old-timers, the picture was becoming clear. They were planning to push me out, probably after our next major client presentation, when my work was complete, but before my patents transferred to the company. I finished my debugging session and packed up my laptop. As I headed to the elevator, I noticed the lights were still on in Gerald's office. Through the glass wall, I could see him and Tyler reviewing what looked like organizational charts. They were pointing at different boxes and having an animated discussion about something. The elevator doors closed and I realized I needed to have a serious conversation with my lawyer. The next morning, I arrived early and found an email waiting for me. Subject line, organizational restructuring. Please review. It was from Gerald, sent at 11:23 p.m. the night before. The email outlined a new structure that would take effect after our upcoming presentation to General Motors in 2 weeks. My role was being evolved into a senior advisory position, focused on legacy system maintenance rather than new development. My salary would remain the same initially, but I'd be reporting to a new technical director who'd been hired to lead our innovation initiatives. I looked up the new hire on LinkedIn. Fresh face, good school, 8 years of experience at recognizable companies. Nothing wrong with his background, but nothing that justified replacing someone with my institutional knowledge and patent portfolio. What bothered me was that they'd made this decision without consulting me or even informing me until after the hiring was complete. This wasn't about organizational efficiency. This was about removing me specifically, probably because I knew too much about how our technology actually worked and owned the patents that made it possible. I spent the morning doing research. Gerald's previous consulting firm specialized in corporate restructuring and intellectual property optimization. Before that, he'd worked for a private equity firm that focused on acquiring tech companies and extracting value from their assets. He wasn't brought in to grow CyberGuard. He was brought in to strip mine EIE. The deeper I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Every company Gerald had worked with followed the same playbook. Identify key technical assets, marginalize the people who created them, then acquire the intellectual property at below market rates. Tyler wasn't just nepotism, he was being groomed to execute this strategy. At lunch, I called my lawyer, Thomas Morrison. We'd worked together on my patent filings and he understood the technical and legal complexities involved. Andrew, based on what you're telling me, you have grounds for serious concern, he said after I explained the situation. Your patents are still your property, and if they're planning to use your technology without proper licensing agreements, that's patent infringement. But I'm employed by them. Doesn't that create some kind of implied license? Not necessarily. Your employment contract covers future inventions, but your current patents predate the specific language in your latest contract renewal. There's a gap in their legal coverage. I felt something shift in my thinking. What would happen if I revoked their access to my technology? Legally, you have that right. Practically, it would probably crash their systems until they could develop alternative solutions. Your authentication protocols are integrated into every client connection, and your encryption algorithms handle all the sensitive data transfers. Without those systems, their platform would be completely vulnerable. I thought about Tyler's dismissive comment and Gerald's patronizing restructuring email. How quickly could you draft a cease and desist order? I can have it ready by tomorrow morning. I made my decision. Do it. That afternoon, I started documenting everything. 22 years of institutional knowledge, system architectures I'd designed, security protocols I'd implemented. The scope was staggering. My work wasn't just part of CyberGuard's platform, it was the foundation that made everything else possible. The authentication system I'd built didn't just verify user passwords. It created secure tunnels between manufacturing equipment and monitoring stations, validated digital certificates for industrial control systems, and maintained real-time security logs that could detect intrusion attempts within milliseconds. The encryption protocols didn't just scramble data. They provided end-to-end protection for communications between factory floors and corporate headquarters, ensuring that production schedules, quality metrics, and safety alerts couldn't be intercepted or modified by hostile actors. When factories like Boeing's needed to know that a software update to their assembly line robots was legitimate and not malware, they relied on my digital signature verification system. When General Motors wanted to monitor their paint booth temperatures remotely without risking cyber attacks that could shut down production, they used my secure data transmission protocols. I'd built these systems because I understood something that MBA consultants missed. In manufacturing cybersecurity, failure doesn't just mean lost data or downtime. It means assembly lines stopping, safety systems failing, and potentially people getting hurt. Every line of code I'd written carried that responsibility. The irony was that Gerald and Tyler were planning to replace me with someone who probably thought cybersecurity was about preventing email phishing attacks. They had no idea that my patents covered the fundamental technologies that kept their biggest clients' production facilities secure and operational. Around 4 p.m., Tyler walked past my desk again, this time with a group of people I didn't recognize. Probably the consulting team Gerald had brought in to assess our technical capabilities. Tyler was gesturing toward the engineering area and talking about optimization opportunities and modernization potential. One of the consultants asked him a question about our core security architecture. Tyler's response was pure business school buzzword salad, something about leveraging cloud-native solutions and implementing agile security frameworks. The consultant nodded politely, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. Even he could tell that Tyler had no idea what he was talking about. I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing my employment contract and patent documentation. Thomas was right. There was a gap in their legal coverage. The intellectual property transfer clause in my current contract only applied to inventions created after the contract was signed. My patents predated that language by 18 months. By 6 p.m., the office was empty except for me and the cleaning crew. I sat at my workstation, looking at the systems I'd built and maintained for over 2 decades. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. The next morning, I arrived early and began preparing for what Thomas and I had discussed. The cease and desist order would be delivered to Gerald at 10 a.m., giving me a narrow window to implement my contingency plan. CyberGuard's platform was designed to authenticate against my proprietary security framework, but the framework itself was hosted on servers I controlled, not on company infrastructure. I'd built it that way initially as a security measure, keeping the most critical authentication components isolated from the main corporate network reduced attack vectors and gave me direct control over system updates. Now, it gave me leverage I hadn't fully appreciated. At 9:45 a.m., I sent an email to the engineering team explaining that I'd be conducting routine maintenance on the authentication system starting at 11 a.m. These notifications were standard procedure. I performed regular updates to stay ahead of emerging threats, and the team was used to brief service interruptions during maintenance windows. Nobody questioned the timing or scope. At 10 a.m., I watched through the conference room glass as a courier delivered an envelope to Gerald's office. He opened it, read the contents, and immediately grabbed his phone. Even from across the floor, I could see his face go red. Within minutes, Tyler was in the office, and they were both staring at the legal document with expressions that ranged from shock to panic. The cease and desist order was straightforward but comprehensive. It informed CyberGuard that Andrew Sullivan was the legal owner of 4 critical patents covering industrial cybersecurity technologies currently integrated into their platform. It demanded immediate cessation of all unauthorized use of these technologies and notification of any existing licensing agreements that might justify continued use. Most importantly, it gave them 24 hours to respond with documentation proving they had legal rights to the intellectual property. At 10:15 a.m., my phone started ringing. Gerald's name appeared on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail. At 10:30 a.m., Gerald's assistant called and asked me to come to the executive conference room immediately. I declined, explaining that I was preparing for the scheduled maintenance window and couldn't be interrupted. The assistant's voice betrayed her confusion. She'd probably never had someone decline a direct summons from the CTO. At 10:45 a.m., Tyler appeared at my desk, trying to look casual but clearly agitated. "Hey Andrew, my dad wants to chat with you about some paperwork stuff. Nothing urgent, just when you have a minute." I looked up from my laptop, where I was reviewing system access logs. I'm in the middle of critical security maintenance. We can schedule something for later this week. It's really just a quick conversation. 5 minutes. "Tyler, I'm about to patch vulnerabilities in the authentication system that protects 50 manufacturing facilities across 3 time zones. If Boeing's factory network gets compromised because I was in a meeting instead of doing my job, who do you think they're going to blame? He opened his mouth to argue, then apparently thought better of it. The kid might have been entitled, but he wasn't completely stupid. Even he understood that cybersecurity failures made headlines for all the wrong reasons. At 11 a.m., I remotely disabled the authentication framework that connected CyberGuard's platform to my patented security systems. The effect was immediate and comprehensive. Every client login attempt failed with authentication errors. Every API call returned security exceptions. Every real-time monitoring session dropped connection as the encryption protocols stopped responding. Within 15 minutes, our customer support lines were overwhelmed with complaints from manufacturing clients whose security dashboards had gone dark. The development team scrambled to understand what had gone wrong, but they couldn't access the underlying systems because those systems were mine, not the company's. When they tried to restart the authentication services, they discovered that the core framework wasn't hosted on CyberGuard's servers at all. It was running on infrastructure I owned and controlled. My phone started ringing constantly. I turned off the ringer and focused on monitoring the system logs from my personal laptop. Everything was working exactly as designed. The authentication framework was running perfectly. It just wasn't accepting any connection requests from CyberGuard's platform. At 11:30 a.m., Gerald stormed out of his office and walked directly to my desk. His face was red and his hands were shaking with either rage or panic, possibly both. "Andrew, what the hell have you done?" I looked up from my laptop, where I was calmly reviewing system logs. "I'm exercising my legal rights as specified in the cease and desist order. My technology is no longer available for unauthorized use. This is sabotage. You're destroying the company. I'm protecting my intellectual property." There's a difference. Tyler appeared next to his father, looking panicked. "Can't you just turn it back on? We can work this out." I met his eyes directly. "You told me it was time for fresh thinking, old-timer. I'm taking your advice. I'm no longer participating in the technical operations of this company." Gerald was already on his phone, probably talking to their lawyers. Other employees were gathering around, trying to understand why half our clients were calling with emergency security alerts. The customer support manager was frantically explaining to someone that they were experiencing technical difficulties, but couldn't provide an estimated resolution time. "This is career suicide," Gerald said, ending his call. "You'll never work in this industry again." "Gerald, I've been in this industry since before you knew what cybersecurity meant. I'll be fine." The head of engineering, Sarah Martinez, approached cautiously. She'd been with the company for 8 years and understood our technical architecture better than anyone except me. "Andrew, what's the scope of the outage? Are we talking about a configuration issue or something more fundamental?" I respected Sarah. She was competent, hard-working, and had never treated me with anything but professional courtesy. I didn't want to put her in an impossible position. "Sarah, the authentication framework is operating normally. It's just not accepting connections from this platform anymore. The framework runs on independent infrastructure using my patents." Her face went pale as she understood the implications. Without my authentication system, CyberGuard didn't have a cybersecurity platform at all. They had user interfaces and business logic built on top of my technology, but the actual security functions, the parts that protected their clients from cyber attacks, belonged to me. At noon, I packed up my personal laptop and headed for the elevator. The office was in chaos. Developers were running between workstations trying to implement emergency fixes that wouldn't work because they didn't understand the underlying architecture. The customer support team was fielding angry calls from manufacturing clients whose production monitoring systems had gone offline. Gerald was in heated conversation with someone on speakerphone who was probably from the board of directors. As the elevator doors closed, I could hear Tyler shouting at one of the senior developers. "What do you mean you can't bypass it? Just write new code." The developer's response was exactly what I'd expected. "We can't just write new code. The entire platform is built on Andrew's framework. Without it, we don't have a security system." I drove home and spent the afternoon fielding calls from reporters who'd somehow gotten word that CyberGuard was experiencing major technical difficulties right before their biggest client presentation ever. The cybersecurity industry was small enough that news traveled fast, especially when it involved a company that handled security for major manufacturing clients. By 5 p.m., 3 different trade publications had reached out for comment. I kept my responses simple. I'm no longer with CyberGuard Industries. You'll need to contact them directly for information about their technical operations. The GM presentation was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Gerald had spent the previous 3 days assembling an emergency team of contractors and consultants to rebuild our authentication system without my patented technology. According to my contacts still inside the company, they had been working around the clock, burning through over $180,000 in emergency consulting fees. The problem wasn't just technical complexity, it was time. Building enterprise-grade cybersecurity systems required months of development, testing, and certification. They were trying to accomplish in 72 hours what had taken me 2 years to perfect. Thursday morning, I made coffee and monitored the industry news websites. Several cybersecurity publications had picked up the story of CyberGuard's technical difficulties, but the full scope wasn't public yet. The headlines were cautious. CyberGuard experiences technical issues ahead of major presentation and manufacturing cybersecurity firm faces system outages. At 9 a.m., I watched the live stream of their presentation to General Motors. Gerald was presenting to a room full of auto industry executives, demonstrating how CyberGuard's cybersecurity platform would protect GM's smart manufacturing systems from cyber threats. He looked confident as he clicked through slides showing threat detection capabilities, real-time monitoring dashboards, and compliance reporting features. The presentation was professionally designed, and Gerald had clearly rehearsed his talking points about next-generation cybersecurity for Industry 4.0 manufacturing environments. At 9:30 a.m., during the live demonstration portion, he invited the GM team to test the platform using demo accounts that had been set up specifically for the presentation. The system crashed immediately. Not just slow response times or minor glitches, complete failure. The emergency authentication system they'd built couldn't handle the load of 20 users trying to access manufacturing security dashboards simultaneously. Error messages cascaded across the projection screen. Database connections timed out. The entire platform became unresponsive. Gerald tried to keep presenting while his technical team frantically worked on laptops in the back of the room. We're experiencing some minor connectivity issues that we'll have resolved momentarily, he announced, his voice betraying his growing panic. But after 10 minutes of watching engineers type desperately while GM executives whispered among themselves and checked their phones, he had to stop the presentation entirely. We're going to take a brief technical intermission, he said, loosening his tie. Our team will have this resolved shortly, and we'll resume the demonstration. They never did. After 30 minutes of failed attempts to restore functionality, Gerald ended the presentation early and asked everyone to leave. The GM executives filed out quietly, their expressions ranging from confused to annoyed. Several were already on their phones, probably calling other cybersecurity vendors. The industry blogs published their reviews within hours. The headlines were brutal. CyberGuard crashes during major client demo. When cybersecurity companies can't secure themselves. GM walks away from failed tech presentation. The most damaging article came from Manufacturing Security, Weekly, which had sources inside both companies. Their headline read, CyberGuard's platform collapse traced to departing engineers' patents. The article explained that the company's core security technologies were owned by a former employee who had withdrawn licensing rights, leaving CyberGuard unable to provide the cybersecurity services they'd been selling. The board called an emergency meeting for Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, Gerald Hoffman was no longer the CTO of CyberGuard Industries. The press release cited strategic differences regarding technical leadership and company direction. Tyler was quietly removed from his position without any public announcement. According to my former colleagues, he'd tried to blame the platform failure on sabotage by a disgruntled employee, but the board's investigation revealed the mismanagement that had led to my departure. His accusations only highlighted the family's role in creating the crisis. The company's stock price dropped 28% over the following week. 3 major clients canceled their contracts, citing concerns about platform reliability and business continuity. One board member resigned. The industry trade publications were calling it one of the worst product launch failures in cybersecurity history. Meanwhile, I was fielding calls from manufacturing companies and private equity firms who wanted to license my patents. Word had spread quickly that the technologies behind CyberGuard's platform were available from the original inventor. Within a month, I'd signed licensing agreements with 4 of CyberGuard's competitors and started my own cybersecurity consulting firm with $3.2 million in Series A funding. The new company, Sullivan Security Systems, specialized in industrial cybersecurity for manufacturing. Our first major client was Ford, who'd been burned by unreliable security platforms in the past. Our second client was Caterpillar, who needed compliance-grade security for their global manufacturing operations. Both companies specifically requested to work directly with me, not with some MBA who'd learned about cybersecurity from PowerPoint presentations. 6 months later, CyberGuard was acquired by a larger cybersecurity firm for 35% less than their previous valuation. The acquiring company's first move was to completely rebuild the platform using industry-standard security frameworks, effectively discarding everything Gerald and Tyler had tried to preserve. Gerald returned to management consulting, though his reputation in the technology sector took a permanent hit. Tyler left the tech industry entirely and took a marketing position at a logistics company in Portland. According to LinkedIn, he now describes himself as a strategic growth professional. No mention of his brief career in cybersecurity. When reporters asked me why I'd left CyberGuard so abruptly, I kept my answer simple. Sometimes you have to protect what you've built. The real lesson was quieter, but more important. Experience and competence can't be faked, and dismissing someone because of their age is a mistake that compounds quickly in an industry built on knowledge and proven results. At 49, I learned that sometimes the best way to prove your value is to show what happens when it's gone.